No one really understood what he was doing there. A skinny, messy-haired young man, with a raspy voice and restless eyes, standing on a stage with nothing but a guitar and lyrics that sounded like they came from a modern prophet. He wasn't from a big city or an artistic family, or any place where you'd expect a cultural revolutionary to emerge. Yet there he was, singing truths disguised poetry, quietly speaking about things others barely dared to whisper. Bob Dylan didn't change music by accident. He did it with intention, with ambiguity, with resistance. He never asked for permission. He never explained too much. In fact, the more they praised him, the more he hid. While young people raised him as a banner for their struggles, he fled from a myth, denied being anyone's spokesman, and took refuge in the only thing that seemed to make sense to him: writing songs that cut like blades and sue like prayers. For decades, Dylan was many things: a protest hero, a folk trader, a mystical troubadour, an unpredictable rocker, an evangelical convert, a Nobel laureate. But he was never not an enigma. And maybe that's why he remains alive in our collective imagination. Because he's not just a figure of the past, but a question that still hasn't been answered. This journey isn't about explaining him. It's about listening to him, through silence's contradictions and verses that still resonate in the souls of those who believe music can change the world, or at least change something inside you. He was just a quiet kid from Minnesota who dreamed of being someone. Nothing in that boy from Hibbing suggested he would one day shift the course of Western culture. He was just a middle-class Jewish kid, the son of a shopkeeper and protective mother, surrounded by old radios, endless highways, and a constant feeling of needing to be somewhere else. Even as a child, Bob fell out of place. While his classmates talked about sports or fit into the small-town routine, he obsessed over Hank Williams, Woody Guthrie, and old bluesmen who seemed to sing straight from the gut. It wasn't just music he was after, it was truth. A truth he sensed wasn't his home, nor his school, nor his family sermons, but somewhere far away, waiting to be found. He loved making up stories about himself. Even as a teenager, he'd say he was an orphan or a circus performer or something equally improbable, not out of malice, but because the common truth wasn't enough. He didn't want to be Robert Zimmerman. He wanted to be something bigger. He wanted to become Bob Dylan. And he chose that name like he knew it would open the door to a new life. When he got to University of Minnesota, it wasn't to study. It was to escape. To dive into the beat movement, into Bohemia, into the cafes where you could sing with your eyes closed and your soul wide open. In those improvised stages, Dylan began trying out his own songs, though at first he was just imitating. He sounded like Woody Guthrie, dressed like him, talked like him. But behind that imitation was something different already taking shape. A sharp gaze, a unique way of observing the world, and an insatiable hunger to be heard. His family, meanwhile, watched with confusion as their son drifted away. They didn't understand why he needed to give up comfort, a predictable future, and familiar love. But Dylan wasn't looking back. He was already writing his own story. And every word he jotted down pulled him further from Hibbing and closer to a dimension where songs weren't just heard. They were felt as if they were your own. Even before success, Bob Dylan was already a disconcerting presence. He was never warm, never easy to approach. His friends said he was brilliant and arrogant, deep and evasive. And even without fame, he spoke as if he knew his voice would one day reach millions. Maybe that's why, years later, when asked why he wrote one song or another, he'd always respond with an ironic smile, as if to say, "What does it matter?" Because for him, the point wasn't to explain, it was to provoke, to spark a reaction, an echo, a crack. That's how it all started. Not with a big hit, or a marketing campaign, or a powerful machine behind him. It began with a lonely boy, uncomfortable with his surroundings, who decided to invent himself through songs. A boy who didn't quite know what he was looking for, but who already understood that the world he'd been handed wasn't enough. And sometimes that's the first step toward changing everything. Greenwich Village, the 1960s. The streets smelled of cheap coffee, cigarette smoke, and revolution. It was a neighborhood of artists, vagabonds, curse writers, and broken dreamers. A place where ideas floated in the air like electricity, and where songs weren't just entertainment but manifestos. Bob Dylan arrived there as an unknown, and it didn't take long for him to become a legend. At just 20 years old, he roamed the clubs with his guitar slung over his shoulder and an expression somewhere between defiant and absent. He sang with a voice that seemed to come from another time, rough, nasal, without the technique or sweetness one might expect from a star. But no one could ignore him. There was something in his words, in the way he stood on stage, that demanded attention, as if every verse was written in a hurry with a sense of urgency. In that universe of troubadours and poets, Dylan found his first allies: Dave Van Ronk, Joan Baez, Ramblin' Jack Elliott. They all saw him as a strange, intense, somewhat dishonest kid, but with undeniable talent. In the cafes, they spoke at him like a secret too powerful to remain hidden for much longer. And so it was. In 1962, he released his first album. It contained barely 2 original songs, but one of them, Song to Woody, was a direct tribute to a man who inspired him to give everything up. Soon, bolder, more political, more incendiary lyrics began to emerge, and with them, the public's attention. But with that attention came pressure, because Dylan didn't just write songs. He wrote diagnoses. Blow in the Wind became an anthem without trying. The times they are a-changin', played as a prophecy of what was inevitable. And while many hailed him as the voice of a generation, he hated it. He didn't want to be a spokesman. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to write. But the world chose him anyway. It placed him at the forefront of marches, quoted him in speeches, and turned him into a moral reference. And Dylan, more and more uncomfortable, began playing a double game. He said what he thought, but also hid behind enigmas. He answered interviews with sarcastic remarks, escaped the labels, laughed at those who tried to define him. In the bars of the village, he was no longer just a promising musician. He was the center of a new cultural consciousness. A kid who, with a guitar and a notebook, was challenging the system more than 1,000 placards. And while many didn't know it yet, he was about to do something unthinkable, betray the movement that had turned him into an icon. But before that, he made it clear that it wasn't about fame or power or ideology. It was about art. And art, for Dylan, could never be comfortable. In a world where everyone was looking for answers, he asked questions. In an era of definitions, he offered ambiguity. And in a time when leaders were sought, Dylan simply replied, "I don't follow anyone." That's why so many loved him. That's why just as many hated him. But everyone, absolutely everyone, listened. Do you think an artist can change the world or can only narrate it? Leave me your thoughts in the comments. There was a tension in the air that couldn't be cut by guitars or verses. The United States was burning from within. The struggle for civil rights, the marches, the speeches of Martin Luther King, everything seemed to signal an inevitable storm. And in the middle of this explosive scenario, Bob Dylan's voice began to sound like something more than music, as if it was speaking directly from the wound of a divided country. Unlike many white artists of his time, Dylan didn't just watch from a distance. He immersed himself in the anger and hope of those demanding justice. He attended demonstrations, climbed on impromptu stages in the middle of protests, and shared space with leaders who knew they could die for saying what they thought. In 1963, he sang at the historic March on Washington, just before King's "I Have a Dream" speech. He wasn't just another musician in the crowd. He was part of the message. His songs began to be quoted in articles, sermons, and universities. Only a pawn in their game, which spoke of the assassination of activist Medgar Evers, spat out an uncomfortable truth. That racism wasn't just individual hatred, but a system that manipulated the oppressed to maintain power. Dylan didn't write from the trenches of pamphlets, but from the depth of someone observing the cracks of a human soul. And yet, despite his proximity to the movement, he always kept himself at arm's length from dogmas. He wasn't involved in any party, nor did he align with any ideology. He just wrote, and that made him even more powerful, because his loyalty wasn't to a specific cause, but to truth, or at least to his unique way of perceiving it. Joan Baez, his political and romantic partner during those years, pushed him to become more actively involved. But Dylan resisted. He felt that every time he was used as a symbol, it reduced him. And he didn't want to be reduced. He didn't want to be a martyr, a leader, or marble. He just wanted to write. In those years, he recorded The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, a heartbreaking song based on a real event. The murder of a black woman by a wealthy white man who received a symbolic sentence. He didn't shout. He didn't insult. He just narrated the facts with a poetic coldness that hit harder than any scream. And in the end, that was his strength. Dylan didn't need to raise his voice to make you tremble, but the more powerful his impact, the more discomfort it caused with the role that was being assigned to him. Some militants were upset that he didn't take a firmer stance. Others saw him as an opportunist, and many fans began to misunderstand him. But Dylan was already in another place. He was always in another place. Because what few understood was that Dylan wasn't writing to be accepted. He was writing to survive. And his art couldn't be imprisoned by any flag, not even the ones he himself had helped to raise. In an interview, he once said, "I don't have answers for anyone. I only have songs." And maybe in times of so much confusion, that was the only thing that could hold us. Do you think an artist has the obligation to be an activist, or is it enough for them to just say what they feel? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. On July 25, 1965, Bob Dylan took the stage at the Newport Folk Festival, wearing a black leather jacket, a Fender Stratocaster slung over his shoulder, and an electric band behind him. 15 minutes of distortion, speed, and fury. And that was enough to divide the world. The audience, used to Dylan's acoustic and committed style, to the prophet with a wooden guitar, received him with a mix of shock, anger, and betrayal. Some booed. Others shouted that they couldn't hear anything, but the general feeling was clear. Something sacred had been broken. Pete Seeger, the icon of traditional folk, allegedly tried to cut the cables with an axe. And Dylan, in between songs, smiled as if he were setting fire to his own statue just to see what happened. That moment went down in history as the electric betrayal. And it was more than just a change of sound. It was a declaration of independence. Dylan wasn't just abandoning folk. He was abandoning the image the world had built for him. He was rejecting being anyone's messiah. His message was clear. Don't use me. Don't explain me. Don't limit me. The album Highway 61 Revisited, released shortly after, sealed this break with a stroke of genius. Songs like a Rolling Stone shattered traditional structures, mixing irony with epic, and placing Dylan at the top of a new revolution, one of smart, corrosive, literary rock. He was no longer just a musician. He was a provocateur, a poet of asphalt, an unpredictable animal. The most purest fans felt betrayed. But a new generation embraced him more than ever. Dylan became more unpredictable, more cryptic, more explosive. His figure stopped being a beacon to become a lightning bolt. Fleeting, brilliant, uncontrollable. And in the meantime, he watched it all from a distance, as if he had realized that the only way to remain honest was to be unstable, that the price of creative freedom was losing admirers and gaining enemies. What's curious is that in that supposed betrayal lay Dylan's deepest essence. The denial of comfort, the contempt for labels, the urgency to reinvent himself before anyone could box him in. "I've been many people," he would later say, "and none were truer than the others." Because Dylan understood something few artists accept, that being true to oneself doesn't always mean being coherent, but being brave. And he was willing to leave it all behind, fame, friends, expectations, just to avoid lying to himself. If you also value artists who take risks even when they lose fans in the process, subscribe now and leave a comment. Has an idol ever disappointed you, only to later inspire you more than ever? At a time when songs were about teenage love and weekend dances, Dylan was writing about corrupt judges pardoned killers, meaningless existences, and the impossibility of understanding the world. He didn't sing to please. He sang to say what no one wanted to hear. After the Electric Revolution, his writing took an even more radical turn. The lyrics became long, enigmatic, filled with symbolism and references that bewildered both critics and fans alike. There were no explanations, no morals, just images, surreal, biblical, political, streetwise. Dylan was creating a new language, one where the song wasn't meant to tell a clear story, but to push you into the abyss of your own interpretations. Desolation Row, for example, was a kind of apocalyptic poem over 10 minutes long, populated by characters like Einstein dressed as Robin Hood or Cinderella arguing with the executioner. There was no apparent logic, but there was a truth that throbbed in every verse. The world was broken, and Dylan knew it. But instead of fixing it, he exposed it. Raw, confused, painful, his way of writing challenged even his fellow musicians. While others tried to sound accessible, he became more cryptic. While pop sought catchy choruses, Dylan preferred poetic monologues with unpredictable structures. And the audience, far from walking away, came even closer, as if they sensed there was something they're worth deciphering. But it wasn't just empty poetry. Dylan spoke from the wound, from the suspicion that words no longer reached, but were still necessary. That's why he wrote the way he did, with contained rage, with biblical irony, with an almost physical urgency. Critics compared him to Rimbaud, Ginsberg, and the writers of the Lost Generation. But Dylan wasn't trying to resemble anyone. He just wanted to be left alone to keep writing. And yet, every album was dissected as if it were a philosophical treatise. Every phrase, a prophecy. Every silence, a statement. And he, in the meantime, kept running away. Sometimes, in interviews, he'd say he didn't understand why people analyze his lyrics so much. They don't mean anything, he'd say with a half-smile. But no one believed him, because even if he was lying, his lie carried more truth than many confessions. The truth is that Dylan didn't want to be understood. He wanted to be felt, for you to feel uncomfortable, for you to ask questions. And in that sense, his lyrics achieved something very few artists manage. They turned the listener into a collaborator, a detective, a mirror. Because in the end, it wasn't just Dylan who spoke in his songs. It was all of us, shouting from some invisible corner of the soul. In July of 1966, at the peak of his fame, Dylan disappeared. A motorcycle accident. That's what they said. That he lost control of his Triumph on a nearby road to his home in Woodstock. That he fell. That he fractured several vertebrae. There were no photos, no official medical report, no clear witnesses. Only silence. And suddenly, the man who filled headlines and stages vanished from a map. For nearly 2 years, Dylan stopped being Dylan. He withdrew to domestic life, took refuge with his wife Sarah and their children, and avoided all public exposure. To some, it was a pause. To others, a strategy. To many, a collapse. The truth is that this hiatus marked a turning point in his story, because the Dylan who came back was not the same. He was no longer the electric troubadour who set auditoriums on fire. He was a quieter man, more introspective, almost foreign to the scene he had once dominated. His music changed, his voice too, and his lyrics began to speak more about the mundane, about family, about the passage of time. As if, suddenly, what mattered wasn't challenging the world, but understanding oneself. During this retreat, he recorded the mythical basement tapes with the band. Songs that seemed improvised, stripped of pretense, like written between cups of coffee and long silences. Themes that didn't aim to save the world, but captured it with unexpected clarity. Dylan was no longer at war with the system. He was at peace with his shadow. And yet, this calmness bewildered many. The audience expected grandeur, social messages, epic moments. Instead, they received an album like John Wesley Harding, sober, minimalist, almost biblical. Then came Nashville Skyline, with Dylan singing in a nearly sweet country style. as if everything before had been another life. Critics divided. Some spoke of maturity, others of decadence. But Dylan, true to his style, didn't explain anything. He didn't give interviews. He didn't appear on TV. And when he finally returned to the stage, he did so sporadically in more intimate concerts, without seeking the fervor of the masses. Because he had learned something essential. The myth can devour you. Being the idol of a generation is a prison as bright as it is suffocating. And Dylan, more than anyone, needed to breathe. That accident, whether real or symbolic, was his way of halting the vertigo, of returning to zero, of remembering that before being an idol, he was a person, and before being a person, he was an artist, and art, for him, could never become an obligation. By the late 1970s, when everyone thought they had seen it all, Dylan surprised the world again. But this time, not with an electric guitar or a new way of writing. He did it with something much more personal, his faith. In 1979, he released Slow Train Coming, a deeply Christian album, filled with biblical references and a spiritual passion that disoriented both his fans and critics. Bob Dylan, the rebel, the enigma, the icon of counterculture, had converted to evangelical Christianity. And he didn't do it quietly. He shouted it. He preached it at his concerts. He defended it with fury. To many, it was incomprehensible. How could the author of the times they are a-changin' now sing about salvation and divine judgment? What had happened to the man who questioned all authority, including divine authority? Some thought it was a phase, others a strategy. But Dylan insisted this wasn't character. It was real. For 3 years, his albums reflected that conversion. Saved, Shot of Love, works in which the spiritual message was more important than the music itself. He even changed the way he performed live. He no longer played his classics, he didn't allow requests, and he used the stage like an impromptu pulpit. In every show, he would let things slip like, "Jesus is coming back, and you better be ready." The reactions came quickly. His fans felt betrayed once again. Critics spoke of a sermonizing Dylan distant, outdated. Even within the evangelical movement, his figure caused unease. It was as if no one quite knew what to do with him. And yet, there was something deeply authentic about that transformation. Dylan didn't seem to be acting. He didn't sound like someone trying to impress. He sounded like someone who had hit rock bottom and found an answer that was uncomfortable, but an answer nonetheless. In later interviews, he would speak little of those years. He would merely suggest that he had gone through a deep personal crisis, and that faith had held him together when everything else was falling apart. He never fully renounced that stage, but neither did he embrace it with the same intensity again. The truth is that his Christianity was as radical as everything else in his life. Uncomfortable, sincere, unpredictable. And though it cost him fans, respect, and visibility, Dylan seemed more interested in saving his soul than his career. Once again, he chose the harder path, the one that didn't promise applause, but solitude, the one that didn't guarantee understanding, but loyalty to oneself. The 1980s arrived, and with them, an era in which many iconic artists lost their way. And Dylan was no exception. His albums from the decade were erratic, some confusing, others downright forgettable. Empire Burlesque, Knocked Out Loaded, Down in the Groove. Albums that today are barely mentioned even by his most loyal followers. It seemed that Dylan was searching for something, but didn't know what. And while he searched, his voice grew rougher, his style more scattered, his energy more subdued. The concerts became unpredictable. Sometimes he shone. Other times, he seemed absent. His live reinterpretations of classic songs were so radical that some fans didn't recognize them until the end. The critics accused him of being on autopilot, a shadow of his former self. And yet, in the middle of that creative fog, something was pulsing. Dylan was entering a new phase, that of demystification. He was no longer the young revolutionary, nor the electric prophet, nor the evangelical preacher. He was a middle-aged man, in crisis with his legacy, at odds with the industry, and tired of being turned into a living statue. Many thought he was finished, that his time had passed, that the fire had gone out. But Dylan had something his critics didn't see, a silent resistance. He didn't need applause. He needed space. And in that space, little by little, he began to rebuild himself. In 1987, he did something unexpected. He went on tour with the Grateful Dead. Then he would tour with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. With them, in improvisations and shared stages, Dylan began to breathe again. He started playing for the sake of playing, to have fun with the songs, to remember that, above all, he was a musician, not a symbol, not an icon, just a man with a guitar and an urgent need to sing. And it was then that he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life, to embark on what he would call the never-ending tour, an endless tour that, since 1988, would take him perform in hundreds, thousands of venues, year after year, without pause, without a final date. That tour wasn't just a commercial strategy. It was therapy, a way to stay alive, to keep moving, to escape the trap of memory. In every show, Dylan rebuilt himself, sometimes shining, sometimes stumbling, but always moving forward, because he understood something few artists understand, that art is not a permanent state, but a practice, and that even when the world turns its back on you, if you keep playing, something can ignite again. In 2016, the Swedish Academy announced something no one expected. The Nobel Prize in Literature would be awarded to a musician, to Bob Dylan. The recognition hit like lightning in the global culture. Some celebrated it as a revolutionary act. Others saw it as heresy. But everyone, absolutely everyone, talked about it. Dylan said nothing. He didn't return calls. He didn't attend the ceremony, not even a video message. Only months later, in a private event, did he accept the award with a speech quoting Homer, Melville, and Shakespeare, an enigmatic, poetic text very Dylan, as if to say, yes, I accept the prize, but don't expect me to change because of it. For many, that Nobel was the final consecration. The proof that what Dylan had done over decades wasn't just music, but living literature. Words that breathed, that bled, that spoke of the world with more force than many books. For others, it was simply another paradox in a career full of impossible turns. The truth is that this recognition didn't change anything about him. Dylan kept touring. He kept rewriting his songs live. He kept releasing albums, some experimental, others absolutely moving, like Time Out of Mind, Modern Times, or Rough and Rowdy Ways, released during the pandemic. Songs from an older, tired, lucid man who watches the world with the calm of someone who's lived enough to not need to impress anyone. By then, no one was trying to decipher him anymore. Dylan had become a mythic figure, but one still alive. A symbol, yes, but one that was never domesticated. And that made him even more fascinating, because while the digital world moved at full speed, he still wrote with a pen, recorded with analog instruments, and played night after night in theaters filled for one reason. No one knew what he was going to do next. He had turned over 80. His voice had become a kind of wise growl, full of history, but his words still cut like slow blades. Dylan no longer sang to change the world. He sang to remind you that the world was never what it seemed. And that was his last lesson. That truth isn't the answers, but in continuing to ask. That authenticity isn't measured in awards, but in loyalty to oneself. And that sometimes the most revolutionary thing an artist can do is simply keep going, without giving up, without dressing up, without asking for permission, because time passes, myths fall, fashions die. But Bob Dylan keeps writing. And in the end, there remains the echo, not of a song, but of a way of being in the world, of looking with different eyes, of refusing to be part of the scenery. Bob Dylan wasn't just a brilliant musician. He was, and is, a crack in the official narrative, a constant reminder that there are other ways to speak, to live, to resist. It's not about understanding him or idolizing him. It's about listening to him, letting his words, the clear ones, the dark ones, the impossible ones, accompany us like an uncomfortable friend, the one who tells you what you don't want to hear, but you know is right. Today, his figure is more necessary than ever, because he still reminds us that art shouldn't please. That truth is not always comfortable, and that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is to keep singing, even when no one fully understands what you're trying to say.